So you told us in the introduction that you spent 34 years in the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Department. Can you tell us a little bit about what inspired you to go into law enforcement in the first place?
Sure. Again, I'm a native of Santa Clara County. I grew up in a marginalized family. Uh, um, I've seen a lot of the atrocities that law enforcement has caused people, but more specifically in terms of me, is I was wrongfully arrested and incarcerated in this county for something I did not do. And the treatment I received at that time and the conditions that I observed led me to want to pursue a career that I could impact people. And after entering the profession, I realized that that impact was mostly on how I treated people. And so I've continued to on that path and spent most of my career as a trainer. And that's the part I try to, in training police officers and law enforcement professionals, I try to change the culture and give people a perspective from all sides.
Powerful, and thank you. So 24 years of your career with the Sheriff's Department has been spent in the main jail, the Santa Clara County main jail. Can you paint a picture for us about the size of that main jail and how many people are normally lows and highs incarcerated there? And give us a start on that.
Sure. The main jail is located downtown San Jose off Heading Street. It is what we consider law enforcement our maximum security facility. So it's has a number of direct supervision housing units, and I believe the capacity to date is right around 700 people there at the main jail. It's been downsized since they recently destroyed the main jail south, the old jail that was built in the 1950s.
So now, if I understand correctly, there's approximately 13 local police departments in Santa Clara County. Most cities have their own departments. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
And most of the departments also have weaponized canine units. Is that your understanding?
That is my understanding.
And can you describe, so again, all police agencies in the county ultimately book their canine bite victims into one place, the county jail.
Yes.
You've observed, am I correct, during the 24 years that you were there, somewhere in the range of 200 police canine victims. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is.
And can you describe the range of injuries you've observed from the feet to the top of the head and in between?
Sure. I've seen people come into our jail who have been bitten from their feet to their head and everything in the middle. So legs, buttocks, groin area, upper torso, neck, head, face. The extent of the damage associated with those dog bites, normally, when I say normally to mean mostly, I should say, are heavy gouging, tearing of the flesh. In most cases, you can see a bone, and in many cases, or in some cases rather, a bone has been broken, and sometimes it's, as I said, it's visible to us from the human eye to see once the wound's uncovered.
So some of the literature that I've read describes a police canine bite as looking very much like a shark bite. Is that an exaggeration or consistent with the canine bites that you've seen over the years?
That's consistent with the canine bites that I've seen.
In reference again to your personal observations of the 200 or so police canine victims that you've observed over the years, can you give us paint us a picture of what the racial makeup of those 200 canine victims are.
Largely brown and black people.
Now, there's a certain culture that we've talked about from time to time, that you describe in the jail as extraordinarily demeaning to the victims of canine bites. That there's often an attempt to make fun of these individuals. So I want you to describe that again. Paint a picture, put yourself back in the main jail, and think about some of the times where you've seen, again, degrading behavior being directed at the victims of these horrendous canine bites.
So yeah, part of the culture is to, for example, if a person's brought into jail and they have suffered dog bites, that rapidly circulates throughout the staff, especially on that shift. So it's very common to bring new people, trainees, down to see, the damage associated to the dog bite. It's very common for, during those interactions, I've heard medical staff as well as bad staff, cops, make comments to the victims of dog bites, such as, if you didn't run or do anything wrong, you wouldn't have been bit. That's what happens to a person who runs and gets bit. You get bit. And if you didn't commit a crime, you wouldn't be running. So there's a huge inference of guilt without due process in those demeaning comments made towards those individuals who suffered dog bites, from my experience.
So the presumption of innocence, does it seem to enter the minds of the law enforcement officers that engage in this kind of behavior, that folks are entitled to the presumption of innocence, and they're entitled to be treated once they're in custody in a dignified manner?
No, the presumption of innocence is not something that's advocated in that environment, and even though we have professional standards, that behavior and that conduct I just described is very common and accepted.
So it doesn't really sound like professional behavior as you describe it. So would you, I know that you ran for sheriff recently, and you didn't make it into the finals, but I guess to the general election. But my question to you would be, if you had been our next sheriff, what would you have done from a leadership, a management point of view to change that culture?
Well, the morale's down, and that's down due to some of the current circumstances involving our recent sheriff of 2 decades, and the corruption. So that, in my opinion, that corruption, that attitude, and that conduct is systemic throughout the management team, and in many cases, some of those people have promoted that conduct. And so my goal would have been to change that culture by changing who's representing us at those decision-making levels, changing the process of internal affairs, giving some civilian oversight with tooth. That was my plan as well. And doing so with the civilian oversight is to promote transparency, which ultimately promotes accountability. And without that, you'll have the same culture of systemic problems and misconduct and corruption in law enforcement.
So I think more than once, we've talked about 2 words: leadership and training.
Correct.
Can you expound on that just a little bit more for us?
Yeah, so first of all, the leadership decides on who gets promoted, who gets hired, the assignments of personnel, who gets assigned to internal affairs, who gets assigned as our public information officer, who basically gives explanations of to put to the public in regards to their questions. And so that's the control of the narrative. And if in the instances where, or I should say, as in the instances where it applies to training, all the training staff is also appointed by the executive staff. So if you don't, if a person in leadership affects those areas, training and leadership, you will either negatively impact the service provider, or you're positively by impacting the culture via training and management.
So I want to move into a slightly different area now. You recently went to breakfast with a couple of your colleagues, in fact, colleagues that you had trained that have now been with the Sheriff's Department for a very long time.
Yes.
And you, at that time, disclosed, came out with the fact that you were going to be here tonight at this webinar, and you were going to disclose to the public what you've observed regarding the dog bites you saw over the 24 years you were in the main jail, and the huge disparity in the racial demographics of the people bitten by these attack dogs. Is that correct? Does that capture the conversation, at least in part?
Yes, it does.
And can you describe the reaction, paint a picture for us of how your colleagues responded to that?
Sure. So when I explained to them the things that I had researched, the racial disparities, the impact to Black and brown people of color, and the abuse of the dogs as well through training, initially there was some resistance to me being here and having this conversation. And it was more associated with the thin blue line of law enforcement. They didn't feel like it should be talked about outside of our own boundaries of our own culture, our own people. And then it went on to a conversation that identified the people, the victim of dog bites, again, as well, if they weren't involved in criminal activity or if they were running, they wouldn't be bit. And some people who were committing those crimes deserve to be bit. And that was the mindset, that was the direction of the conversation. So when I responded with the fact that we have a use of force continuum for a reason, and the human element, we substitute that animal biting with a police officer, generally the damage isn't as extensive, generally. And that was rebuffed with, well, we as police officers have to be safe. That's why we have the dog. And again, of course, it reverted back to the perception of many law enforcement professionals that if you weren't involved in activity, then there would be no need for use of force, and that force wouldn't be brought upon you.
And I know that, so now we've talked about the fact that a large preponderance bitten by these attack canines are people that at best have committed a misdemeanor. Is that,
yes,
I'm stating the research in the area accurately?
Yes.
And did they seem to even want to engage you on the conversation of the disparity in the racial makeup of the victims of these canine attacks?
That part of the conversation was not, it was avoided. I mean, it wasn't, they didn't want to talk about, and that's typical, and I say typical culturally, law enforcement, we don't like to talk about the obvious racial disparities associated with us doing our job.
So, I mean, you've worked with most of the people in the department at one time or another, or talk. What, in terms of this mindset, can you quantify the percentage of the members of the Sheriff's Department as currently made up that have the same kind of mindset, that there's nothing wrong with sicking dogs and cruelly training dogs and then putting them on human beings?
70 to 80% has that, in my opinion, has that mindset, and the remaining percentage is not necessarily indifferent, but most of them are afraid to say the obvious in fear of retaliation.
You've talked about the brutality, the maiming of people, ripping off scalps, shark-like to the bone bites. Given all of that, do you personally believe, as you are here tonight talking to us, that the practice of having flesh-eating canines, police canines that bite into people should be banned now?
Yes, I believe that the way the police departments are using police canines is not humane. And I say in that referencing or specifically that comment, I mean not humane to the animal or the public. And for those reasons alone, the dog should be removed from service.
So this is the article or series of articles that includes some YouTubes from the Marshall Project, Mauled When Police Dogs Are Weapons. I just suggest that if you're really interested in finding out more, to check this out. The Marshall Project has really done some excellent work relating to criminal justice. It's pretty intense to watch some of the videos, but again, I'd suggest you might check it out. Also, as we were discussing this evening, there are a number of different references that you can look at, and I'm not going to read through them now, but again, research some of these things, educate yourselves. And I think the key thing here is we need to really educate our elected officials, whether they be at the state level, the county, the city level. We need to meet with our police chief, our sheriff, the people that make the policy decisions about this. I think that a lot of our elected officials really aren't aware of how extreme these injuries are and how there's the disproportionate impact. So I think we really need to educate our politicians and our public officials. And that's really important to do.